Somewhere along the forgotten river roads of Louisiana's sugar country, there exists a forgotten coroner's report filed away in the archives of Plaquemines Parish in the autumn of 1858. It lists 9 separate fatalities over a span of 5 years, all classified vaguely as death by misadventure or pulmonary collapse. 9 men, all wealthy sugar plantation owners, all prominent pillars of their community, all found dead with one terrifying, unspoken similarity. The small crescent-shaped contusion discovered at the base of the throat, perfectly centered, suggesting a sudden immense pressure. The official records will never tell you that the local physicians, all intimidated by the victim's power and status, were ordered to lie. They will never admit that the actual cause of death was crushed cartilage and asphyxiation, the silent work of 2 immense hands. Tonight, we uncover the story of a man they call Big Jacob, a slave whose 7-foot stature and profound silence were used to conceal a terrible, methodical campaign of justice against the men who destroyed his voice and his life. Before we continue the terrifying tale of Big Jacob and the justice that stalked the bayou, we need you to be part of this investigation. If stories like this, where the truth has been buried beneath layers of wealth and complicity, make your blood run cold, hit that subscribe button right now and tell us in the comments what state or city are you listening from tonight. We want to know where our community of truth seekers is watching from. Now, let's step back into the heat and humidity of 1845, to a world where power was absolute and silence was a weapon. The plantation known as Belle Rive sat on the west bank of the Mississippi River, deep in the heart of Louisiana's wealthiest sugarcane territory. Its main house, a sprawling 2-story Greek Revival manor, stood as a monument to the staggering fortune amassed by its owner, Jean-Pierre Beaumont. Beaumont was not the typical, hands-on plantation master. He was a creature of New Orleans society, spending most of his time gambling and entertaining, leaving the brutal day-to-day management of Belle Rive to his overseer, a former Irish mercenary named Silas O'Malley. In 1845, the enslaved population of Belle Rive numbered over 300, a massive workforce required for the relentless labor of sugar production. Among them was a man named Jacob. He was not born at Belle Rive, but had been purchased as a teenager from a smaller, bankrupt estate in the Carolinas. Jacob was, in every measurable way, an anomaly. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that stretched the limits of his rough clothing and hands the size of dinner plates. His strength was legendary, even in a system built on physical labor. But what truly set him apart was his intellect and his capacity for compassion. He had been a man who loved to talk, to use his voice to tell stories, to lead songs, to debate and reason. He had been a man who found joy in the spoken word, until the incident. The incident occurred in the summer of 1846, 2 years after Jacob's arrival at Belle Rive. O'Malley, the overseer, was a man whose cruelty was matched only by his paranoia. He believed the only way to manage a workforce of 300 was through absolute public terror. One evening, O'Malley discovered Jacob teaching a young boy, the son of the head cook, how to read a passage of scripture. Literacy among the enslaved was forbidden, not just by law, but by the plantation's strict rules. O'Malley dragged the boy away, but his true target was Jacob. He brought Jacob to the center of the quarters, ordered him bound, and proceeded to administer a severe beating designed not just to punish, but to break. The spectacle was terrifying, but even more horrifying was a methodical final act. O'Malley, in a calculated move designed to silence a voice he feared, had a rough leather gag and harness fitted tightly over Jacob's mouth and jaw, secured with heavy, reinforced buckles. "You love to talk, don't you, big man?" O'Malley had sneered, his face inches from Jacob's. "Well, from now on, you will do your work in silence. You will never speak another word on this plantation. Your voice is mine now." The punishment was permanent. The leather apparatus was not a temporary gag. It was a custom-made muzzle that Jacob was forced to wear every waking hour, only removed for eating under direct supervision. It left no visible scar, but it was a constant, physical constraint on his jaw and throat, an unbearable reminder of his forced silence. It was a torture designed to destroy his mind, not just his body. From that day on, Jacob, or Big Jacob the Silent, as the other slaves began to call him, became a ghost of his former self. He moved through the sugar cane fields and the crushing house with an unnerving, deliberate quietness. His eyes, intelligent and mournful, spoke volumes that his mouth could not. The other enslaved people avoided him out of fear, pity, and the unsettling nature of his silence. They knew the power that lay coiled within his massive frame, and they feared the consequences when that power inevitably snapped. But Jacob did not snap. Instead, he channeled his colossal, suffocating rage into an icy, patient observation. He began to pay attention to the men who wielded power at Belle Rive and beyond, the men who visited Beaumont, the rich planters who controlled the parish, the ones who had laughed at his forced silence and the misery of those around him. The silence, initially O'Malley's weapon, became Jacob's shield. Because he could not speak, no one suspected him of having a thought. Because he could not complain, no one suspected him of having a plan. In the isolation of his silent world, Jacob began to develop a terrifying, methodical design for justice against the system that had stolen his voice, his family, who had been sold south before the incident, and his dignity. And the men who would pay the price were the 9 masters who embodied the casual, absolute cruelty of the Sugar Kingdom. The first target was selected in the winter of 1853, 7 years after Jacob was silenced. 7 years of forced observation had given Jacob an education in the lives of the masters that no book could provide. He knew their routines, their weaknesses, and their sins. The first man was Henri Latour, the owner of the neighboring plantation, River's Bend. Latour was known for his extreme violence and had been an enthusiastic spectator during Jacob's silencing. Latour also suffered from severe chronic asthma, a detail Jacob noted and filed away. Latour had a predictable habit. Every Tuesday night, he would ride alone into the back acreage of his plantation to meet his mistress, a free woman of color who lived in a secluded cabin near the swamp line. It was a perfect convergence of routine, isolation, and a pre-existing medical condition that could provide cover for a silent act of destruction. Jacob had managed to loosen the leather buckles of his muzzle just enough to allow for a slight, painful movement in his jaw, a feat of sheer, immense pressure that only a man of his strength could sustain. He had learned how to breathe in short, sharp bursts, how to move through the thick undergrowth of the bayou without snapping a single twig. On a moonless Tuesday night in January 1853, Jacob waited. Latour arrived on horseback, dismounted, and walked the final 100 yards to the cabin. Jacob emerged from the shadows of a massive live oak, moving with the terrifying speed of a striking viper. Latour, a heavy, aging man, barely had time to turn before Jacob was upon him. The immense hands, which could crush sugar cane stalks with a single squeeze, closed around Latour's throat, perfectly placed at the base of the larynx. There was no struggle, no sound, only a swift, silent application of overwhelming force. The goal was not to strangle, which would leave obvious bruising, but to crush the delicate cartilage of the windpipe in a way that mimicked a sudden, massive internal collapse, a technique Jacob had observed in the field when an ox's neck was broken by a falling load. He held the pressure for only a heartbeat, enough to achieve the devastating effect, then released. Latour collapsed instantly, his body convulsing briefly as his lungs tried and failed to draw breath past the damaged cartilage. Jacob stood over the body for a moment, the silence of the swamp amplifying profound, ringing silence in his own world. He adjusted the leather muzzle, now wet with the sweat of exertion, and vanished back into the shadows. Latour was found the next morning. The coroner, a nervous local doctor named Etienne Dubois, examined the body under the watchful eye of Latour's family. Dubois noted the slight bruising, but attributed the death to a severe asthmatic attack, an unfortunate but plausible natural cause exacerbated by the cold night air and a sudden fright. No one questioned the conclusion. No one mentioned the giant, silent slave from a neighboring plantation. Jacob made his first entry into a hidden journal that night. He could not speak, but he could write. He used a sharp piece of slate and charcoal, scratching letters onto the back of discarded plantation manifests, which he concealed beneath the dirt floor of his cabin. His entry was chillingly brief. 1. The voice of the viper is extinguished. The silence is noted. The next 7 months passed without incident. Jacob returned to the relentless, back-breaking labor, the forced silence, the crushing heat of the sugar season. But now there was a difference. The methodical planning and the single, devastating execution had sharpened his focus. He no longer felt the suffocating despair. He felt purpose. His second target was Pierre Du Bois, the cousin of the coroner, a man who had made his fortune by providing loans to desperate planters, often seizing their land and human property when they failed to repay. Du Bois was a methodical villain, a man who enjoyed watching the ruin he created. He was also a lover of fine wine and had a habit of retiring to his private library after dinner with a bottle of the most expensive Bordeaux. Du Bois's library was in a separate wing of his plantation house, accessible only through a long, secluded corridor. In August 1853, in the oppressive, thick heat of the Louisiana summer, Jacob was leased out to Du Bois's plantation to help with emergency cane processing. This kind of labor transfer was common, and Jacob's unusual strength was highly sought after. Jacob saw his opportunity. On a stifling Saturday night, Jacob waited until the house was dark, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant croaking of frogs. He moved through the house with the supernatural stealth of a predator, his immense size somehow contributing to his silence. He found Du Bois in his library, asleep in a large leather chair, a half-finished bottle of wine on the table beside him. The assassination was a chilling mirror of the first, swift and absolute. The immense hands, the single perfect application of force to the vulnerable throat, the momentary silent agony, and the final collapse. Jacob placed the bottle of wine back in Du Bois's hand, careful to smudge the glass with the man's own fingers. When Du Bois was found the next morning, the coroner, the nervous Etienne Du Bois, was called once more. The cause of death was declared a sudden cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke brought on by excessive alcohol consumption and the heat. The official report noted a slight discoloration on the neck, but concluded it was merely a blood vessel bursting during the fatal event. The real truth, the silent truth, was filed away. Jacob returned to Belle Rive 2 days later, his presence completely unremarkable. His journal entry was equally succinct. 2. The man who drank the blood of the poor now drinks only the silence. The methodical nature of Jacob's revenge was what made it so terrifyingly successful. He waited months between each killing, varied his method of access, and targeted men whose medical history or lifestyle made a sudden, non-violent death plausible. He was building a pattern of natural, separate fatalities, not a string of murders. He was the one thing no one suspected, a silent avenger with a physician's understanding of the body and a monster's strength. Over the next 3 years, the list of victims grew. 3 more men, a cotton factor who financed slaving voyages, a judge who routinely separated families, and a planter who had shot a slave for a minor infraction, all met their end with the same crushed windpipe and the same falsified coroner's report. By 1856, 5 of the 9 men on Jacob's list were gone. But the string of wealthy, prominent deaths was beginning to attract attention, not from the authorities, who were too invested in maintaining the illusion of social order, but from a source far more dangerous, a private investigator from New Orleans, hired by a consortium of concerned plantation owners who feared a supernatural or political plot against them. This investigation, run by a meticulous former detective named Marcel LeBlanc, would be Jacob's greatest threat. Now let's pause. If the meticulous, chilling nature of this revenge is holding you captive, hit that like button right now and leave a comment with your theories about how Jacob is maintaining his terrifying secret. Do you think LeBlanc will discover the pattern before Jacob completes his mission? And before we reveal the chilling escalation of Jacob's campaign, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest secrets. Now, let's return to 1856, where the silence of the bayou was about to be broken by the quiet diligence of a man from the city. Marcel LeBlanc was not a man of the sugar country. He was an urban creature, accustomed to the corruption and complexity of New Orleans, which made him uniquely suited to see past the gilded facade of the plantation aristocracy. He was hired in the summer of 1856 by a nervous group of planters who had noticed a disturbing, statistically unlikely loss of their colleagues over the previous 3 years. LeBlanc began his investigation not by focusing on the victims, but on the pattern of their deaths. He obtained copies of the coroner's reports, a difficult, expensive task, and spread them across his desk in his small New Orleans office. Latour, asthmatic attack. Du Bois, cerebral hemorrhage. Bertrand, heart failure. Chauvin, accidental drowning, found in a drainage ditch. Boudreaux, apoplexy. 5 prominent men, all dying alone, all under plausible but slightly suspicious circumstances. Leblanc's meticulous, methodical mind rejected the randomness. The single common denominator, he realized, was the region, Plaquemines Parish, the wealthiest, most tightly controlled section of the Sugar Coast. He spent months interviewing servants, seers, and even the nervous coroner, Etienne Dubois. He quickly realized that the official reports were unreliable. The doctors had been intimidated by the families of the deceased. But when Leblanc pressed Dubois on the specifics, the nervous coroner, fearing for his own reputation, finally confessed the truth. There was a mark, Monsieur Leblanc, Dubois whispered one humid afternoon in his office, checking to ensure the door was locked. A small, perfectly formed contusion at the base of the throat. On all of them. I was told to ignore it, to attribute it to anything else. They were prominent men, monsieur. We could not have a scandal. Leblanc felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. A contusion, a crushing, that spoke of a killer with precise, overwhelming physical power. But who? The victims were too disparate, their locations too varied to suggest a single killer moving randomly. The assassin was not just killing. They were selecting, hiding, and calculating. Leblanc pivoted his investigation, focusing now on the environment surrounding the victims. He began to check the work ledgers of the deceased planners, looking for any recurring names or transfers of personnel that overlapped with the dates of the deaths. It was a laborious, painstaking task, but within weeks he found the silent, unsettling common denominator. All 5 victims, within a year of their demise, had either leased, employed, or had contact with a single individual, a slave of extraordinary size, known only by reputation because of peculiar affliction. The man they called Big Jacob the Silent. Leblanc traveled to Belle Rive in the late autumn of 1856. He presented himself as a representative of the consortium, interested in the general security and management of the plantation. He spent a week observing. He watched O'Malley, the vicious overseer, and the owner, Jean-Pierre Beaumont, who was increasingly paranoid about the atmosphere of dread that had settled over the parish. And he watched Jacob. The sight of the man was startling. 7 feet tall, moving with a controlled, unblinking focus, wearing the thick leather muzzle that silenced his voice and gave him an air of terrifying, animalistic menace. Leblanc watched Jacob work the cane fields. His physical power, so immense that he seemed to move in slow motion compared to the frenetic pace of the other workers. He watched Jacob eat, the muzzle removed under the stern, suspicious eye of O'Malley, the man eating in complete, unnerving quiet. Leblanc spoke to other slaves, discreetly, carefully, never mentioning the murders. He only asked about Jacob, about the incident that led to the silencing. The answers are consistent. He was a good man, a smart man. O'Malley broke his jaw with the muzzle. They stole his voice. Leblanc understood the profound significance of that theft. The motive was not robbery, not politics, not passion. It was a cold, precise justice for a profound, unique injury. The killer was not just strong. He was silent. He was physically incapable of a struggle or shout that would betray his presence. He was a force of nature, weaponized by the very system that sought to contain him. But Leblanc needed proof. He needed a connection, a weakness, something to break the man's terrifying, perfect control. And Jacob, aware of the new man observing him, sensing the shift in the air, knew that his time was running out. His journal entry from that period was a stark reckoning. The dog of the master smells the trail. I must move with the speed of the viper and the silence of the grave. For remain, Jacob accelerated his timeline. He needed to complete his mission before Leblanc could connect the silent dots. His next target was Silas O'Malley, the overseer who had initiated the campaign of silence. O'Malley was a man of routine and confidence, which made him predictable. Every evening, he retired to his cottage, locking the door and drinking cheap whiskey until he passed out. Jacob's plan was audacious. Kill O'Malley at Belle Rive itself, on the very property where his silence was enforced. It was a risk, but the proximity to the man who had stolen his voice demanded immediate action. Jacob planned the act for a Saturday night in late November 1856, after the final crushing of the cane for the week. The plantation would be quiet, the other workers exhausted. Jacob had spent weeks observing O'Malley's movements, the angle of the door to his cottage, the placement of the windows. He realized that brute force would be too loud, too obvious. He needed stealth. Jacob used his immense strength to methodically remove a portion of the small, high window pane in O'Malley's cottage, a process that took him 3 nights of excruciating, silent labor with a borrowed, dull knife. On the night of the attack, he slipped through the opening, his huge frame contorting with a terrifying, unnatural flexibility. He found O'Malley passed out in his chair, a half-finished bottle of whiskey on the floor. Jacob stood over him, the man who had stolen his voice now breathing loudly in a drunken stupor. The revenge was swift, final, and profound. The massive hands, the crescent-shaped mark, the silent, terrifying asphyxiation. Jacob adjusted the window pane, erased any trace of his entry, and returned to his quarters. O'Malley was found the next morning. The cause of death was attributed to acute alcohol poisoning and pulmonary failure. A natural end for a man who drank himself senseless every night. But LeBlanc, still on the plantation, received the news with immediate, chilling certainty. The silent killer had struck again, and this time, the victim was the overseer responsible for the killer's very silence. This was not a random killing. It was a profound act of personal, terrifying justice. 6 down, 3 to go. The next 3 targets were the most difficult, the wealthiest, and the best protected. They were the triumvirate who formed the core of the parish's political and financial power. The owner of Belrive, Jean-Pierre Beaumont, the man who tolerated and profited from O'Malley's cruelty, Senator Elias Vance, the state politician who wrote the laws that enforced the brutality, and finally, Colonel Thaddeus Marchand, the banker who financed the entire suffocating system. LeBlanc knew that the investigation was now a race against time. He knew the killer was Jacob, but how could he prove it? The evidence was ephemeral. A small mark on the throat, a connection of overlapping work histories, and the unnerving, profound silence of the alleged killer. LeBlanc tried to secure an arrest warrant for Jacob, but the parish officials, fearful of a massive scandal and a slave rebellion, refused. They would not arrest a slave for the murder of prominent citizens without undeniable material evidence. LeBlanc, recognizing futility of working within the system, made a desperate decision. He would try to catch Jacob in the act. His focus turned to Jean-Pierre Beaumont. If Jacob had targeted the man who stole his voice, he would surely target the man who owned that silence. Beaumont was preparing for a lavish New Year's Eve ball, a massive event that would draw the entire parish elite. Jacob, serving as a silent, immense domestic worker, would have unprecedented access. LeBlanc's journal entry from that period captured his desperate tension. I am tracking a ghost, a giant who kills without sound, and is protected by the very silence they am. NAL. Securing its safety, and in a gesture of profound respect, he removed the leather muzzle that had silenced Jacob for 12 years. For the first time in over a decade, Jacob was free to speak. He stood in the lawyer's office, feeling the air rush over his mouth and throat. He opened his mouth, and a sound came out, not a word, but a dry, rattling cough, the sound of a voice box long atrophied from disuse. He tried again. The sound was a low, agonizing croak, like stones grinding together. The injury O'Malley inflicted was too profound. His voice was gone. Jacob wrote his final instructions on the slate. The truth is now safe. Tell the world what the silence accomplished. Then, in a final, chilling act of self-determined justice, Jacob went to Colonel Marchand's villa. He did not go with stealth or silence, but with a terrifying, open simplicity. He walked up to the heavily guarded gate, his immense body a towering, impossible figure in the Baton Rouge street. The guards, terrified by the sheer size and reputation of the man, opened fire. Jacob was struck multiple times, but his immense body, hardened by years of brutal labor, kept him standing. He walked through a barrage of bullets, reaching the terrified Colonel Marchand, who had emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of the gunfire. The final justice was administered in the open, witnessed by the terrified guards and the fleeing citizens. The crescent-shaped mark, the crushed windpipe, the final silence. Jacob stood over the body of the last victim, then collapsed, his lifeblood spilling on the ground, his purpose finally achieved. He died not as a slave, but as a man who had delivered his own final justice. The trial of Jacob the Silent was a farce. He was dead, but the state, driven by the furious, paranoid planners, put him on trial posthumously, sentencing him to be hanged in effigy, a bizarre attempt to restore the illusion of legal control. But the true trial was conducted in the court of public opinion. Lawyer Caldwell, true to his promise, had Jacob's journal printed and distributed throughout the North and even, secretly, within the South. The story of the 7-foot man, silenced by cruelty, who used that silence as a weapon to destroy the 9 masters who embodied his oppression, became a sensation. It fueled the fires of the abolitionist movement, providing a chilling, tangible narrative of the violence inherent in the system. The journal, a simple slate-end charcoal manuscript, became a symbol of silent resistance. It proved that justice, denied through legal means, could find a terrible, powerful pathway through the hands of a man determined to reclaim his dignity. The legacy of Big Jacob the Silent was not just the 9 deaths, but the permanent, crippling fear he instilled in the men of the sugar country. The planters of Plaquemines Parish spent years looking over their shoulders, terrified of a colossal, silent figure that might emerge from the shadows. The official records of the 9 deaths remain sealed in the parish archives, the final, undeniable truth of the crushed windpipes buried forever. But the story survives in the whispers of the enslaved, in the hidden journals of the abolitionists, and in the memory of a giant who proved that absolute power is never truly absolute. The greatest weapon against tyranny, as Jacob proved, is sometimes not a thunderous voice, but a terrifying, perfect silence. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that Jacob's actions were justified by the immense suffering and the destruction of his voice? Or was his revenge simply another form of the violence that created him? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this chilling tale from the sugar country's buried past. If you enjoyed this dark journey into America's hidden history and want more stories that reveal the secrets our ancestors tried to forget, subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex truths that lie beneath our nation's official histories. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly buried. It's always waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to dig. The silence always tells the truth, posed upon him. I pray he shows his hand before the new year, or this entire parish will be buried in silence. The New Year's Eve ball at Belrive was a spectacle of wealth and false gaiety. Hundreds of guests crowded the manor, drinking, dancing, and discussing the coming cotton season. Jacob, wearing a plain, heavy linen coat, moved through the throng with the unnerving grace of colossal shadow, his leather muzzle a grim contrast to the silk and lace of the guests. Beaumont, the owner, moved through the party with a mixture of paranoia and arrogance, occasionally catching the eye of Jacob and flinching slightly at the man's immense, silent presence. Jacob's plan was simple. Beaumont often retired to his private study around midnight to count the day's winnings and review ledgers, a habit of the meticulous gambler. The study, located on the ground floor, offered a moment of solitude and opportunity. As the clocks chimed midnight, Jacob made his move. He slipped away from the ballroom, moving toward the study. But LeBlanc was waiting. The investigator had stationed himself in the shadows near the study, concealed by a heavy velvet curtain. He saw Jacob approach the study door, his immense hand already moving toward the latch. LeBlanc stepped out, his hand on the hilt of his pistol. "Stop, Jacob," LeBlanc commanded, his voice sharp against the distant sound of the celebratory music. Jacob froze. He turned his massive body slowly, his eyes meeting LeBlanc's across the dark hallway. The immense, silent figure of the slave was an overwhelming presence in the narrow space. There was no fear in Jacob's eyes, only a profound, mournful exhaustion. LeBlanc saw the truth laid bare. The avenger was not a monster, but a man driven to a singular, terrible purpose. "I know it was you," LeBlanc stated quietly. "9 men, the crushed windpipes, the silence that covers your tracks. You did this." Jacob stood motionless, unable to answer, the thick leather muzzle covering the mouth that had been so long silenced. He simply nodded once, a brief, sharp movement of his immense head. LeBlanc felt a strange paralysis, a profound, Human recognition of the justice in Jacob's terrible acts. He held the pistol, but his finger refused to tighten on the trigger. Why? LeBlanc asked, though he knew the answer. Jacob reached a massive hand, the hand that had killed 9 men, and touched the leather muzzle over his mouth. The gesture was more eloquent than any speech. They stole my voice. They stole my life. The moment was broken by a sudden sound. The study door creaked open, and Jean-Pierre Beaumont, drawn by the sound of the confrontation, stepped out. He saw LeBlanc, the investigator he distrusted, holding a pistol. He saw the immense figure of Big Jacob standing silent and menacing. But all Beaumont saw was a slave out of place, an insult to his authority. What is the meaning of this, LeBlanc? Beaumont demanded, his voice slurred with liquor and arrogance. Jacob, get back to the kitchens immediately, or I'll have O'Malley. He stopped. He remembered O'Malley was dead. But before he could issue a new threat, Jacob moved. He moved not toward Beaumont, but toward LeBlanc. In a flash of speed that defied his size, Jacob's massive hand closed around LeBlanc's wrist, wrenching the pistol away and throwing it down the corridor. He then placed his other hand, open and palm up, into the center of LeBlanc's chest, not with violence, but with profound, terrifying force that drove the investigator back against the wall, stunning him. Jacob looked at LeBlanc, his eyes communicating a message of terrible, desperate clarity. You know the truth. Do not interfere. Then Jacob turned. He moved on Beaumont, not as a killer, but as a force of nature finally unleashed. Beaumont, seeing the immense, silent figure bearing down on him, finally understood the terror that had claimed his colleagues. He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. The immense, powerful hands of Big Jacob the Silent reached out, and the final judgment was delivered. The sound was a dull, sickening crunch, barely audible over the distant New Year's celebration. Jacob released the body, which collapsed instantly, silently, without a sound, onto the polished wood floor. 7 down, 2 to go. Jacob looked at LeBlanc one last time, a brief, silent communication of purpose and grim finality, then vanished through a side exit into the night. LeBlanc, recovering from the shock, stared at the body of Jean-Pierre Beaumont and the trail of blood and silence that led away from Belle Rive. He had his proof, but the killer was gone. The aftermath of Beaumont's death was chaos. The discovery of the body, the presence of LeBlanc, the investigator's desperate testimony about the silent giant. It all led to a frantic, widespread manhunt. The focus was now on 2 remaining targets, Senator Elias Vance and Colonel Thaddeus Marchand. Jacob, however, was already ahead of them. He knew that the only way to complete his mission now was to move with unparalleled speed and audacity, for his element of surprise was gone. His journal entry from the night of the New Year was a confession and a promise. 7. The master of the silence is silenced. The night is short, and the day brings a rope. I will not stop. The next morning, Senator Elias Vance was found dead in his bed in his New Orleans townhouse. Vance had arrived in the city late the previous night after fleeing the disaster at Belle Rive. The cause of death was ruled to be a massive heart attack, a believable end for a man known for his excessive lifestyle. But the coroner, now under immense pressure, noted the familiar, crescent-shaped contusion at the base of the throat. Jacob had tracked the senator from the plantation to the city, moving through the night with a determination that defied his size and the dangers of a slave fleeing his master. He had used his stealth to enter the townhouse, and his knowledge of human weakness to find Vance alone and vulnerable. 8 down. Only Colonel Thaddeus Marchand remained. Marchand, the banker who financed the entire system of human bondage in the parish, was the final, most protected target. He was a meticulous, paranoid man who never traveled alone and was constantly surrounded by armed guards. He had fled to his impenetrable, heavily fortified town villa in Baton Rouge, convinced that the killer would not dare follow him into the state capital. Marchand was wrong. Jacob's final act was a masterpiece of silent planning and terrifying dedication. He arrived in Baton Rouge 2 days later, not as a killer, but as a man who had sold his own immense body for a specific, singular purpose. He presented himself to a prominent abolitionist lawyer, a known figure in the city, who had long sought to expose the brutality of the parish planters. Jacob, Using his slate and charcoal, offered the lawyer a single deal, arranged for the printing and distribution of his full, handwritten journal, the one detailing the 9 killings and the profound injustice that drove them, in exchange for his surrender. The lawyer, a man named Edmund Caldwell, was horrified but mesmerized. He read Jacob's account of his life, his voice, his family, and the terrifying, methodical acts of justice he had carried out. The story was a devastating indictment of the entire plantation system, a narrative of immense power and unimaginable suffering. Caldwell agreed. He took the juror,